Blackridge City, it's a place where power and corruption go hand in hand. Beneath the glimmering skyscrapers and bustling streets lies a darker truth. A truth controlled by an invisible hand. A syndicate known only as the Crimson Vow. When Councilman Henry Watts is found dead in his locked study, the case seems simple. But for Detective Elise Hart, this is only the beginning. A cryptic note, a shadowy symbol, and a web of lies that stretches deep into the heart of the city's most trusted institutions. As Detective Elise digs deeper, she uncovers a conspiracy that threatens everything she stands for. Friends become enemies, allies become suspects, and trust, it's just another illusion. In a city where everyone has a price, how far will one detective go to uncover the truth? And when the lines between good and evil blur, will she survive long enough to finish the fight? The deeper you go, the darker it gets. Hello viewers, I'm back with another gripping chapter of Wicked Chronicles. This is a three-part story filled with unraveling mysteries and shocking twists, so sit back, relax, and immerse yourself in the first part of this thrilling journey. The rain was relentless, a steady downpour that blurred the neon lights of Blackridge City. Detective Elise Hart drove through the empty streets, the tires of her car slicing through shallow rivers of water pooling along the asphalt. The city always felt different at night, darker, heavier. Tonight was no exception. She pulled into the long driveway of Councilman Henry Watts' mansion, the grandeur of the estate stark against the dreary weather. The gates had been forced open by officers earlier, their jagged edges still glistening with rain. The mansion, illuminated by spotlights from the police cars, stood like a fortress, beautiful but cold. Elise stepped out of her car, the storm immediately assaulting her. She tightened her trench coat and pulled her hat lower over her face as she ducked under the yellow crime scene tape. The air was thick, not just with rain but with something else. An unease that had nothing to do with the weather. Detective Hart, a uniformed officer, called out, jogging toward her. It was Mark Hayes, a young officer who always seemed eager to prove himself. His face was pale, his voice edged with something close to fear. "You'll want to see this one." Elise nodded, brushing past him toward the mansion. Inside, the opulence of the house hit her immediately. Marble floors gleamed under ornate chandeliers, and gold-framed paintings lined the walls. Everything was pristine, except for the study. The study was an anomaly. The polished mahogany desk was scattered with papers, the air heavy with the scent of wine and something faintly metallic. At the center of it all was the body of Henry Watts, slumped forward in his chair. His lifeless eyes stared at nothing, and his face was twisted in a grimace of fear or pain. Perhaps both. Elise's eyes shifted to the wall behind him, and her breath caught. There, painted in vivid crimson, was a symbol. A perfect circle with letter A written in the middle. The paint was still wet, dripping slightly, but the lines were precise. Whoever had done this wanted it to be seen.
What do we know so far?
Not much. The housekeeper found him around 9. She said the study was locked from the inside, and she had to force the door open.
Locked from the inside?
Elise frowned, walking toward the desk. She examined the glass of wine still clutched in Watt's hand. It was half full, the liquid dark and rich. She sniffed the air and caught a faint, bitter almond scent. Cyanide, most likely. Classic, effective, and easily concealed in wine.
The scene feels staged. Everything about this is too perfect.
She knelt beside the desk, her trained eyes scanning for anything out of place. A smudge of powder near the rim of the glass caught her attention, but something else tugged at her instincts. The desk mat looked slightly uneven, as if something had been tucked beneath it. She carefully lifted the corner and pulled out a folded piece of paper.
Bag this?
She said to Hayes, holding the paper up with her gloved hand. She unfolded it and read the message scrawled across it in frantic, uneven handwriting. "The Crimson Vow holds the strings. You'll regret crossing us. Her stomach tightened. The name was familiar. Whispers of a criminal syndicate that supposedly controlled Blackridge from the shadows. She'd heard rumors during past investigations, but had never come across concrete evidence. If Watts had crossed them, his murder was more than political. It was personal.
Detective, there's something else you need to see.
Elise followed him to the corner of the room, where a surveillance camera was mounted. The small red light on its base indicated it had been recording. But when Hayes handed her a tablet linked to the system, the screen showed nothing but static.
Footage is corrupted. We're trying to recover it, but so far, no luck.
Elise felt her unease deepen. Everything about this scene was deliberate. The sigil, the poisoned wine, even the erasure of the security footage. It was like someone had gone to great lengths to control every aspect of the narrative. As she turned back toward the body, she noticed a faint smear of mud on the edge of the desk. It was barely noticeable against the dark wood, but it was there. She crouched down, tracing the smudge with her finger.
Was anyone outside the house before the housekeeper called it in?
No one saw anything. The gates were still locked when the first officers arrived. If someone was here, they didn't come through the front.
Elise straightened, her mind racing. A locked room, corrupted footage, a cryptic message, and a sigil painted with surgical precision. Whoever had done this wasn't just sending a message. They were setting the stage for something bigger.
Has anyone notified internal affairs?
Why would we bring them in? This is a murder, not a corruption case.
Because Watts wasn't just a councilman. He was on the city's oversight committee. If he was investigating something involving the Crimson Vow, this case is going to get political fast.
I'll make the call.
Elise returned to the desk, her gaze lingering on the sigil. It wasn't just a mark, it was a signature, a calling card meant to intimidate anyone who dared to get too close. As she stepped back, her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out and frowned at the screen. An anonymous text had come through. "You're already in the web, detective. Watch your back." Her heart skipped a beat, but her face remained unreadable. She slipped the phone back into her pocket and glanced around the room one last time. The Crimson Vow had just declared war, and Elise had a feeling this was only the beginning. The morning sky over Blackridge City was a dull, oppressive gray. Detective Elise Hart drove through the bustling downtown streets, the city beginning to stir despite the rain still lingering in the air. Her thoughts were heavy with the details of the Watts case. Poison, a locked room, a cryptic note, and that crimson sigil that lingered in her mind like a bad omen. Her destination loomed ahead, the high-rise penthouse where Catherine Watts, the widow of Councilman Henry Watts, lived. The building was a symbol of the kind of power and privilege the councilman had wielded during his life. Glass walls that reflected the city's skyline, and doormen in pressed uniforms who nodded curtly as Elise passed. Elise reached the penthouse and rang the doorbell. It took several moments before Catherine answered, and when she did, her appearance gave Elise pause. Her eyes were red and puffy from crying, her hair was hastily tied back, and she clutched a tissue in her trembling hand.
Detective Hart.
Catherine said, her voice breaking slightly as she stepped aside to let Elise in. The interior of the penthouse was as pristine as one would expect. Tasteful modern furniture, abstract art on the walls, and a panoramic view of the city's skyline. Yet there was an emptiness about the place, an air of stillness that made it feel more like a museum than a home.
I'm sorry to disturb you, Mrs. Watts.
Elise began, taking a seat on the couch. Catherine gestured toward.
I know this is a difficult time, but I need to ask you some questions about your husband.
Catherine nodded, sitting opposite Elise and wrapping her arms around herself.
Henry, he wasn't himself these past few weeks. He was distant, paranoid.
Paranoid?
Elise prompted, leaning forward slightly. Catherine nodded again.
He kept saying he was being watched, that someone was following him. At first I thought he was imagining things, but then...
She trailed off, her gaze dropping to her hands.
Then what?
Elise asked gently. Catherine hesitated, her fingers twisting the tissue she held.
He started locking himself in his study for hours at a time. He wouldn't tell me what he was working on, but he said it was important. He said he was close to uncovering something big, something dangerous.
Elise's mind raced.
Did he ever mention a name, an organization, anything specific?
Catherine hesitated again, and for a brief moment, her eyes flicked toward the window before returning to Elise.
No. He just told me that if anything happened to him, I shouldn't trust anyone, not even the police.
Elise ignored the sting of that statement and pressed on.
Did your husband have a safe in his study?
Catherine blinked, startled by the question.
Yes, he made me memorize the code in case of an emergency. Why?
There was a safe in the study when we processed the crime scene. It had already been opened. Do you know who else might have had access to it?
Catherine looked genuinely confused.
No one. Henry never shared that code with anyone but me.
Elise filed away Catherine's reaction, though she couldn't help but notice the subtle shift in the widow's demeanor. Her hands had stopped trembling, and her voice, though still shaky, carried a hint of something else. Apprehension, maybe, or calculation.
There's something else I need to ask. Have you ever heard the name Crimson Vow?
Catherine's reaction was immediate but fleeting. Her lips parted slightly, her eyes widening ever so briefly before she quickly looked away, shaking her head.
No, what is that?
Elise didn't press further, but her instincts told her Catherine knew more than she was letting on.
It's just a lead we're following. I'll need to speak to you again as the investigation progresses.
Of course, anything I can do to help.
Back at the precinct, Elise couldn't shake the feeling that Catherine was hiding something. The timing of her reactions, the subtle shifts in her body language, it all pointed to a woman who knew more than she was willing to admit. But the safe bothered Elise the most. When Elise returned to the crime scene later that afternoon, she went straight to the study. The room still bore the faint chemical scent of the forensic team's work, but the safe loomed untouched in the corner. Elise crouched beside it, examining the keypad. There were no signs of forced entry, no scratches or scuffs. Whoever had opened it had done so with the correct code. She punched in a request to the precinct to trace the councilman's financial records, hoping they might reveal something about his investigation. As she waited, her phone buzzed. Another anonymous text. "You're looking in the wrong place. Watch the widow. Cipher." Elise frowned, the message only adding to her unease. Was Cipher warning her, or trying to manipulate her? Her thoughts were interrupted by a call from the Financial Crimes Division.
Detective Hart, we found something unusual in Watts's records. He transferred $2 million to an offshore account last month.
An offshore account? In whose name?
That's the thing. It's under a shell company. We can't trace it back to anyone directly, but the account was flagged in connection to suspected money laundering operations tied to
what?
To an organization called the Crimson Vow.
Elise's heart sank as she ended the call. If Henry Watts had been transferring money to the Crimson Vow, it meant one of two things. He was either trying to pay them off, or he was working with them. Neither possibility sat well with her. The case was becoming more tangled by the hour, and Elise knew one thing for certain. Catherine Watts wasn't the only one keeping secrets. Thank you for joining us for the first part of our story, but this was only the surface. What comes next will take us deeper into the shadows of Blackridge City. Elise Hart thought she was investigating a single murder. Now she's uncovering something far more sinister. The deeper she digs, the more she realizes that Councilman Henry Watts' death wasn't just a crime, it was a warning. And she may be the next target. The Crimson Vow isn't just an urban legend. It's real, it's powerful, and it has its grip on the city in ways Elise never imagined. Secrets will unravel, betrayals will surface, and the people she thought she could trust may not be on her side after all. In the next chapters, Elise will have to push past the lies, the deception, and the fear to uncover the truth. But in a city where power is bought and loyalty is a myth, one question remains. Will she survive long enough to expose it? Stay tuned. The game has only just begun. Don't forget to subscribe to this channel to catch the next part of the story.